When I first got into boxing, I always wanted there to be another great American heavyweight champion of the world. Now let me explain myself. Back in 2005, I first discovered boxing at the age of 13. Alright, I was a 13-year-old kid. And I was obsessed with it. Like, what I mean by that is, I would come home from school and instead of playing video games like, normal kids would do, I would sit down, go on YouTube, and search all of the classic fights. Alright, I would watch, obviously, the modern fights that were happening at that moment, but I would also go back and look at, classical fights. And one of the divisions I looked at the most was the heavyweight division. I sat there and I looked at several and did so much research. I did so much research on the heavyweight division. I spent hours upon hours and years upon years doing research and looking at the great heavyweights of the past. And I quickly discovered something. I quickly discovered that the heavyweight division has a rich history of American heavyweight champions. I quickly realized that for the longest time, the heavyweight division was basically run by the Americans. I saw that back in the, back in 1905, 1906, guys like Jack Johnson was the heavyweight champion of the world. I saw the fact that guys like Jack Dempsey was the heavyweight champion of the world. I saw that Joe Louis won the heavyweight championship of the world in 1937, and he defended it for 10 whole years. From 1937 till he retired in 1948. Right? I saw that guys like Rocky Marciano was the heavyweight champion of the world. I saw that guys like Floyd Patterson was the heavyweight champion of the world. I saw that guys like Sonny Liston was the main guy at heavyweight. Then I saw the 1960s, and I saw that, young heavyweights like Muhammad Ali, then known as Cassius Clay, came along. He was, talking a lot. He basically changed the way, he basically brought excitement to the heavyweight division because he was not only, he was very flamboyant, right? He was talking a lot of smack. That's something that fighters didn't do back then. Fighters weren't talking smack for years. Jack Johnson was a guy who talked smack back in 1905, but during this time, they didn't allow, unfortunately, black fighters to fight for championship belts, and that's why for many years there wasn't a black heavyweight champion until they basically allowed that to happen again, and Joe Louis came along. But Joe Louis was never a trash talker, right? He was always, he always stayed humble. But then during the 1960s, Ali came along and he just started talking a lot of shit. And he basically bring personality to boxing, bring excitement. Then I saw that guys like George Foreman, Ken Norton, or Kenny Norton, Joe Frazier, all these guys came during the 1970s, and they all fought each other, and they were the dominant heavyweights. Then I saw that in the 80s and late 70s, guys like Larry Holm came along and he ruled the heavyweight division. I also saw that in the late 80s, guys like Mike Tyson were considered the best heavyweights. And one thing I noticed is all these guys had one thing in common. They were all Americans. And I quickly realized that Americans ran the heavyweight division for such a long period of time. Then came the 90s where, guys like Evander Holyfield, Riddick Bowe, even Mike Tyson, even George Foreman, and other guys, Michael Moore, Shannon Briggs, all these guys came along. But then a switch happened, Guys like Lennox Lewis came along, who was from the UK. Guys from the Ukraine started coming along, right? And I remember sitting there in the year 2005, 2006, looking at the modern times. I'm 14 years old and I'm looking around and I noticed something. I remember thinking to myself, everybody in the heavyweight division, none of them are Americans. I saw guys from Ukraine. I saw guys from Germany. I saw guys from Russia. I saw all these fighters who were considered the top heavyweights at the time, but none of them were Americans. None of them could relate to me. And at the time, when you first get into boxing, you are biased. You are biased because it's natural for you to be supporting guys from your home country. I remember, it was for me when I first started watching boxing. I've said this in the past. I was I supported American fighters because I was an American. Especially when I was 13, 14, I was like, okay, I'm going to support him because he's American. I'm pretty sure if you're from the UK, if you first started watch boxing, you're going to be looking at the guys that are from the UK, right? You're going to be looking at all those guys because that's where they come from, where you're from. And then eventually you're going to, when you become a hardcore boxer fan, you're going to look at the history of the sport. That's how it was for me when I first started watching boxing. I was looking at the history of the sport of the heavyweight division, and I saw that it was run, like I said, by the Americans. And I remember sitting there, and this was at the dawn. When I first started watching boxing, it was literally the dawn of the Vladimir Klitschko era. It was when he had won, his second run, because I know he won his first title, I think it was the WBO heavyweight strap back in the early 2000s, but then he lost it against what's that guy? Corey Sanders. And then he began his second run in the year 2006. I never saw Vladimir Klitschko's first run at heavyweight because I wasn't watching boxing at the time. But when I started watching boxing, his second run and his long reign began. I saw all of Vladimir Klitschko's title defenses from 2006 till his last fight against Anthony Joshua in 2017. I grew up watching the heavyweight division during the Vladimir Klitschko era. And I remember always feeling annoyed. I feel annoyed because I was, a boxing history buff, and I saw that the Americans, the people who came from where I'm from, were dominating the heavyweight division for such a long period of time. And here we are. I never remember at the time thinking, man, here I am looking at the best heavyweight, and doesn't even speak English. He doesn't speak my language. He's from the Ukraine, but he lives in Germany. He fights out of Germany. I saw that guys like Alexander Povetkin, Shagayev, all these guys who were considered the best guys at heavyweight, I noticed that they were all not Americans. And I remember feeling annoyed by it and thinking to myself, what happened to the Americans? How come now that I'm watching boxing, there's no great Americans? How come back in the 80s, 70s, 60s, 50s, 40s, 30s, there was great American heavyweights? But now, when I get into boxing, as an American, I don't see any great Americans. I saw that during the late 90s, there was a shift. And it changed from the Americans. I honestly believe that the last great American heavyweight champion was Evander Holyfield, because he was the last guy who came from the 80s, the 90s. And when he lost to Lennox Lewis, everything basically for the Americans, it all changed, because then it became, the Lennox Lewis era. Then after Lennox Lewis retired, it became basically all the top legit heavyweights were all from the Ukraine. And it became the Klitschko eras, basically, European fighters. And like I said, at the time, I was thinking, what happened to the great American heavyweights? At the time, we had some heavyweights like, Calvin Brock, who came along, guys like Lamont Brewster, Tony Thompson, Chris Arreola, but these guys were not great. These guys, the minute they fought for a world title, would get utterly destroyed. They would just get battered. It was really an embarrassment. I remember watching when Calvin Brock fought Vladimir Klitschko, and I was biased towards Calvin Brock because at the time, like I said, I was young. I was about 16 at that point, or maybe 15. At that time, I wanted there to be a great American heavyweight, and he got destroyed by Vladimir. And I remember thinking to myself, man, what the hell? What happened to the American heavyweights? They suck. They absolutely suck. So for years and years, I grew up basically being a heavyweight boxing fan and a hardcore heavyweight boxing fan, basically in a heavyweight boxing history buff. But I was always annoyed that, it was run by Vladimir Klitschko, because I can't relate to Vladimir. I relate more to UK fighters, or to in general, I relate more to UK boxing fans than any other boxing fans, because UK boxing fans, they speak like me, they speak English, guys like Lennox Lewis, he spoke English. Anthony Joshua, he speaks English. But a lot of these guys from foreign countries, they don't speak English. They don't need, some of them don't even speak an ounce of English. Some of them, if they do speak English, is a very broken English. So it's hard to understand. You cannot relate to someone if you can't even understand them. So that's why I never could relate to Klitschko. I respected Klitschko as a champion, but I never related to him because he's not where I'm from. He doesn't even speak my language. And I always thought he was kind of a dull champion. He never had no personality. He wasn't flamboyant. He was a very respectful, humble type of fighter. But he just didn't speak my language, and I could never relate to him. But I still watched him because I was a fan. But I remember during that time, I spent a lot of my youth just watching. Well, a lot of my at the start of my boxing experience, my whole boxing, when I first got into boxing, I spent a lot of that time just looking at old videos from the past, like the Ali's, the Mike Tysons, the Ernie Shavers, the Riddick Bowes, all the Americans, because I was just hoping and really wishing that there was another great American heavyweight. Then as the years went on, I started looking at other divisions like, the super middleweights, the light heavyweights, the, welterweights. And I quickly became a fan of that, and I started less focusing on the heavyweight division, and I started focusing on as a boxer fan, I would look at a lot of the welterweights. I started looking at Floyd Mayweather Jr. fights, and I remember at the time thinking, well, the heavyweight division, all the Americans there suck because for some reason the heavyweight division just sucks by, there's no great American heavyweight anymore, but at least there's good fighters in other divisions. I remember at the time Floyd Mayweather Jr. was considered the number one fighter in the world, and he was an American. So I was like, okay, Floyd Mayweather Jr. is not a heavyweight, but he's an American, and he's a fighter. So I'm going to support him because of that. So I was even looking at other divisions. I was looking at welterweight divisions and super welterweight divisions or light heavyweights to see other great fighters from that division, just to make me feel better because there was no great American heavyweight. I remember thinking, okay, there's no great American heavyweight, but hey, at least we got Floyd Mayweather Jr. He's the number one pound for pound fighter. At least we got Andre Ward. He's the best super middleweight. At least we got, this other guy who's the best this. That's how sad I was at the state of the heavyweight division during the 2010, 2011, that I was just thinking to myself, at least we have other great fighters in other divisions. That's how depressed I was for the heavyweights division at that time. Then came David Haye. I was a fan of David Haye because when David Haye came along, David Haye spoke English, right? He spoke trash. So he was a guy who spoke English, and he's from the UK, right? And he spoke He talked a lot of trash. I remember in the press conference he came in with a shirt with both Klitschko's head decapitated, and I remember, but I was rooting for David Haye. I was like, please, David Haye, because David Haye was talking a lot of shit. He was building up the fight. He excited me. This was the first time I got excited as a boxing fan, as a heavyweight boxing fan. I was like, yes, we got this guy who talks English. He's a trash talker. He's from the UK, and he's talking all this trash. I hope he wins. I was rooting for David Haye. David Haye loses. Doesn't put up a great fight. Once again, the Klitschko era continues. Then came the early 2012, 2013. This was when a lot of people started talking about Wilder. Wilder this, Wilder that. Okay. At this point, the patriotic boxing fan that I was when I first started watching boxing in the year 2005 was disappearing from me, because I was accepting that, it's not just about being an American, it's about a whole, boxing is so many people, they come from so many countries. So at this point I was fading. My whole thing of being patriotic was kind of fading, and at this point I was a fan of Klitschko. At this point I was a fan of Povetkin. At this point, I was looking at other, I was a big fan back in 2013. I was a big fan of Carl Froch. I was also a big fan of Andre Ward. I was a big fan of Sergey Kovalev. A lot of these fighters who aren't American. I was a big fan of Manny Pacquiao, was still fighting. And I remember when Wilder came, I was starting to disappear, this whole patriotic side of me, right, as a boxing fan. But then it started to emerge a little bit. You know what I'm saying? It started to emerge. I started thinking to myself, Deontay Wilder's an American. He's a big puncher. He's knocking everybody out. And I started, you know what I started doing? I started looking at videos of Mike Tyson and all this. And I was like, wait a minute. Maybe Deontay Wilder is our next great American. Maybe finally we have an American that I can feel proud of, that he's here and he's going to become unified. And I was rooting for Deontay Wilder. I said, I hope he fights Vladimir and he knocks him out and he becomes the unified champion. I remember at this time, 2013, I was looking at Vladimir Klitschko tapes like crazy and looking at Wilder's tapes like crazy and trying to analyze what I think would happen if they two fought. What were Deontay Wilder's chances if he fought him with his current style? And then I noticed that Deontay Wilder was not fighting legit opponents. He was fighting shit level opponents. And for the longest time, I defended that. I defended it. I was like, you know what? I want that because I wanted for so long. I wanted there to be a great American heavyweight champion again. So even though Wilder was cherry picking, I was hoping that it was him. Okay, I was hoping that he was this fighter. Then he fights Bermane Stiverne. He beats him. He becomes the heavyweight. He becomes the first American heavyweight champion in years since Shannon Briggs was champion back in 2006. And I remember thinking to myself, I was so proud. I was like, yes, Deontay Wilder, he's finally our next great American champion. He's the WBC heavyweight champion of the world. And then you know what he did? He defended his belt against Eric Molina. And that was the time where I stopped caring anymore about being patriotic. Like, that patriotic side of me died. And I was like, you know what? Forget it. I can't keep defending Wilder. And I can't keep just hoping that there's a great American champion. I can't keep hoping because I saw films from the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, and I saw that back then America was rich with heavyweights. I can't keep depending on that, and that's why I hope that Deontay Wilder is the next great American. And then I realized that other fighters out there, you know, the heavyweight division is just not what it used to be back then. And I have to stop focusing on, you know, these guys just being Americans, just being great. So I started seeing other fighters, and I started seeing guys like, I started getting excited for the heavyweight division because guys like, you know, Anthony Joshua came, Jarrell Miller came, you know, even Dominic Brazil came. I was looking at a lot of Amir Mansour fights back then. Dillian White came, and this was the end. And Tyson Fury, when Tyson Fury beat Vladimir Klitschko, I know this video is all over the place, but guys, I'm just making this video. I didn't plan this video. I just sat down, pressed play button, pressed the record button, and I started. So again, if I'm all over the place with this video, I apologize. I felt like making this video, guys. When Vladimir Klitschko lost to Tyson Fury, that fight was so boring. It was so boring, but it was the best thing that happened to the heavyweight division because it freed the heavyweight division. Vladimir Klitschko had the heavyweight division on lockdown for almost 10 years. I grew up watching Vladimir Klitschko's entire second reign as the unified champion, and I was sick of it. By the year 2015, I was sick of it, and like I told you already, I was hoping for the next American heavyweight. So when Tyson Fury beat Vladimir Klitschko, I was so happy. I was like, I even wrote on Twitter. It's still up on my Twitter account, not on this Twitter account, on my personal Twitter account. I wrote a message saying, "Thank you, Tyson Fury, for finally freeing the heavyweight division." I swear to God, I wrote that. That's how happy I was. I was like, yeah. I said, "Thank you, Tyson Fury, for finally freeing the heavyweight division from Vladimir Klitschko." You know, and again, I never had anything against Klitschko. I thought he was. I think you should respect him. I do respect him as a champion, but I never related to Klitschko. You know, I never could relate to him, and I just didn't like his style. So I was so happy when Tyson Fury, even though that fight was lame as hell and dull, I was so happy when he dethroned him. Now and then, as the years have gone, and as I've matured as a boxing fan, and as I learned to appreciate resumes and all this, I realized that Wilder never became that great heavyweight champion that I was always looking for. I was always looking for that great next heavyweight champion again, because I saw the tapes from the past when I was a very young boxer fan, and for the longest time I hoped it was Wilder, but it ended up not being Wilder. The next great American heavyweight ended up being a guy who was not American, who was a guy who was from across the pond, which was Anthony Joshua. He's really what I wanted. I wanted Wilder to be that. I wanted there to be another great American heavyweight that happens to have all the belts and be considered the baddest man on the planet. Like Mike Tyson was. Like Larry Holmes was. Like Joe Louis was. But that never happened. Instead, I just had a champion, an American champion in Wilder, who cherry-picked a lot of his opponents and who never unified. So I finally let that go, that it has to be an American. I want there to be a next great American. I let that go because, and I realized it can't just be about one country. You can't just look at it, because I was looking at it for the longest time as, especially when I was like a teenager, as America is so rich with American history, boxing heavyweights. There has to be another great one, and I hoped it was Wilder, and it wasn't. Hopefully one day there is a great American heavyweight who comes along and who is the unified champion of the world, and I could sit here and say this guy is an American and he's the best heavyweight in the world, and I could be proud. I could be proud of him as an American boxer, man. I could be making videos saying this guy is the #1 heavyweight, and be happy to make videos and not be chastising him or be criticizing him, and instead be praising him and saying this guy's the best dude. I would love to make videos saying you're just jealous. A lot of people be saying that you're just jealous because no guy in American is this. I would love to be saying, I would love to, you UK boxing fans, you guys are lucky that you guys have a legit true champion in Anthony Joshua, and you guys should really support him, because right now the heavyweight division, the best heavyweight I consider is Anthony Joshua. So you UK boxing fans, you should be happy that you guys have like that one true heavyweight that you guys could say, yes, because I'm pretty sure if you're from the UK, you feel proud of Anthony Joshua, right? You feel proud that British boxing, that the heavyweight division is huge and is basically exploding right now in terms of value, entertainment. Like, you guys should be really happy that you guys, and fortunate that you guys have, Dillian White, Tyson Fury, George. Right now, the British UK boxing in general and the British heavyweights are they're popping off, right? So you guys should feel thankful that that's happening, because that's something I wish I had, right? I wish as an American boxing fan, I wish, especially when it comes to other divisions, no, because right now, like, the welterweights is run by Americans, but like, that's something I wish I had for the heavyweights. I wish I could say that the best heavyweights are Americans, but I can't say that. I am a fan of several American heavyweights. Like, I think that Jarrell Miller, I think he's a problem. I think he could be a champion one day, but he'll have to face, Anthony Joshua first, like, see if he could beat him. But when it comes to Wilder, I can't feel proud of Wilder. I can't sit here and be like, yeah, he's the next great American heavyweight that I always wanted, because he didn't do what I wanted him to do. He didn't unify with Anthony Joshua. I wanted you to unify with Anthony Joshua. I wanted you to fight Vladimir Klitschko in 2013. Deontay, I wanted that. But you never did it. For years, my entire boxing experience so far was about wanting there to be a great heavyweight champion, and you were supposed to be the one, and you didn't do it. You didn't do it, man. I can't sit here and say you did. That's why I root for guys like Joshua. I root for guys like that, because they're doing what I always wanted there to be in the heavyweight division. They're doing the right thing, what you're supposed to do. That's what they're doing. Anyway, guys, this video is way too lengthy, and I hope you guys enjoyed. If you guys watched the whole video, thank you. I do appreciate it. And yeah, I'm out.